So today I want to cover the sentence leading into the poem, which goes into the first stanza of the poem saying, "So I wrote a poem containing 9 clues that if followed precisely will lead to the end of my rainbow and the treasure." I'm going to examine the comments about Fenn's rainbow through his perspective as an archaeologist. So I've come up with 3 potential meanings for the end of Fenn's rainbow, and a couple of them tie in very well to the parallels with Fenn and Richard Wetherill and where I think that they both may end up. The first, in consideration with the perspective of Fenn as an archaeologist, is a little bit more abstract to fit the poem, but I wanted to include it just because I think it's interesting. And that is that archaeology, as you're uncovering a site, when you're going down into the layers of soil, that there are different layers, kind of like a layer cake, that you'll be going through. And those layers are used to date the artifacts in association with each other. So when you start on the top, those would be the most recent artifacts. You may find a pot, a piece of pottery or an arrowhead on the surface. As you go down, maybe you find a flat stone where natives used to grind flour, and you know that that is older than the arrowhead because it's on a layer that emerged lower than the arrowhead as you were going into your dig. So on and so forth. Each progressive level is older and older. And so that was my first example of a rainbow, because more often than not, those layers are different colors. So you may get a sand and silt top layer with a layer of, say, carbon-rich coal that's very dark, a yellowish layer of sandstone, and as you go through, each subsequent layer can be a different shade. So from the side profile, it actually could resemble a rainbow. In Chaco Canyon, where Richard Wetherill was eventually buried, the soil eroded away, leaving the cliffs about 40 to 70,000 years ago. Fajada Butte, where the Sun Dagger is and where Fajada Gap is, that gap eroded from the cliffs over a course of about 10,000 years, leaving the gap. Another interesting fact I found while researching the erosion and creation of Chaco Canyon itself as a geologic feature had to do with this boulder that the natives identified. When they were building Pueblo Bonito, they identified a boulder which came to be known as Threatening Rock and understood that it would eventually fall down from the cliff face and chose to brace it with a wall of stone, just like they built their buildings out of, but the only purpose for the wall was to keep this boulder from falling. Eventually, this boulder was called Threatening Rock because of its reputation and its precarious nature, but this boulder called Threatening Rock fell in 1941 and destroyed over 30 rooms of Pueblo Bonito. The bottom of Chaco Canyon is filled with 38 meters of alluvium, which is a mix of clay, silt, and sand, just like you'd find in a river delta where it runs into the ocean, and all those sediments collect and are dropped out of the flowing water once it slows down. So imagine that, 38 meters, about, what does that come out to, maybe a 12-story building. That's how far down the geologic Chaco Canyon goes until you reach bedrock, where that erosion stopped. The rest of that has been filled up today through heavy rainfall and washes that funnel into the canyon from higher ground. Interestingly, that alluvium is a big reason of why Chaco culture could thrive. They were able to grow crops on that very fertile soil called alluvium. They also were good at managing their water supply, and in some of the things that I've been reading, it sounds like there wasn't much more water than there is today, which would surprise a lot of people. But that canyon is full of break dams, which slow the flow of water, and also has dozens of potholes that are carved into the bedrock itself at the top of the different rincones around Chaco Canyon. And then they've also discovered some masonry reservoirs where there's a stone wall built, filled in, completely watertight, bigger containers to hold water. So they did have a water management system in place. In 1983, there was a competitive federal leasing program. As many of you probably know, those ruins aren't just contained within the canyon. There's an entire network of ruins far outside the canyon. And the leasing program led to competitive bids on getting the land by coal miners because there's a substantial layer of coal. This eventually led to the Chaco Roads project, which was aimed at protecting everything that is connected within that Chaco network, and one of the best ways to trace the connection is because Chaco natives had built roads that connected site to site. So you can actually see from outside of the canyon a road that's built straight and an old path, and how that leads visually to another ruin, and then prove the connection into that network because of that infrastructure that they've put up between those sites. The second example of how a rainbow can fit the poem and lead to Fenn's eventual resting place, I actually got from a surprising source, which was Kyle Sandow. Many of you guys may know his YouTube channel as being very highly critical of Fenn and the treasure, believing that Fenn has been lying to everybody so that he could hide the treasure in San Lazaro and understand that it won't be found, that he can send people kind of on a wild goose chase by giving misleading information, have that chest in place while he's selling books and whatnot, and has a previously set up network of associates to manage everything from websites to book publishing, publicity, all of that, knowing full well that he could have hidden the chest and no one could get to it because it's on his private property. That's Kyle's theory, but he mentioned something that I ended up looking into, which was that the Kiva structure, within the Kiva structure, everything has a meaning, and the meaning behind the ladder of a Kiva is that it's the rainbow. So I'm going to go into a little bit of an example, and I'll include a link which gives a tour to a Kiva. It's pretty cool to check out. It's at the Aztec ruins in New Mexico. This is from the Acama original myth. Iatiku, aka the old spider woman, made the first Kiva so that the kachina she had created would feel welcome. A Kiva is a round ceremonial structure that's underground and represents the Shipipu, where original natives emerged from the underworld into this realm. A Kiva completes the village and represents the Shipipu, the place of emergence, where the original natives climbed up from the underworld into today's realm. There are beams made from 4 separate species of wood, which represent the trees that the original natives climbed to get to this realm. Yellow turquoise went under the foundation to the north, blue went to the west, red went to the south, and to the east there was white turquoise. Prayer sticks were placed in each location alongside the turquoise to ensure that the foundations of the walls would never collapse. And the shape of the structure, which is a circle, represents the shape of the sky. 4 species that are, again, the same 4 species that the original natives used to ascend, make up the roof and represent the Milky Way galaxy. The ladder represented the rainbow, connection between spiritual and physical realms. Medicine Man was instructed to make a fireplace under the ladder, which was called there. There was a hollow place in the floor in which an altar, like Iatiku created originally, was kept. Medicine men were the only ones allowed to dance on that altar, and when they were trying to get superhuman powers, they could either dance or roll on that altar to collect the energy from it. In the north, there's a hollow in the wall of the Kiva, which represents the powers that rule. There's the North Mountain, East Mountain, West Mountain, Sun and Moon, and prayers to these forces were directed to this doorway. When entering or exiting a Kiva, you should never look back. If you do, it's understood that your soul will be left inside the Kiva until your family carries an offering of food to the Kiva. When your family was trying to help you reassociate your soul with your body by giving an offering of food and bringing that to the Kiva, they would arrive at the Kiva, which would look like a hole in the ground with a ladder coming out of it. The process dictated that they would have to yell, The process dictated that they would have to make their arrival known by yelling down into the Kiva. They were supposed to call out and yell, "Below." For those entering or exiting a Kiva, it was mandatory that you move to the right. First step off the ladder into the Kiva and you move to the right to find your place. And as you're exiting the Kiva, you move to the right until you arrive at the ladder where you can exit without looking back. You never whistled in a Kiva, you never took fire from the fireplace in a Kiva, and you never stopped on the fireplace in a Kiva. The third tie-in to rainbows and Forrest Fenn and the parallel life of Richard Wetherill is through the general Navajo belief of what a rainbow is, and I think it's the most realistic tie-in to Forrest Fenn's poem. It has to do with the Navajo belief around rainbows and spiritual cohesion. The Native American Navajo expressed the idea of initiation. Their wisdom describes the rainbow as a multicolored serpent, and when seen by a young brave, the serpent is to be ridden. That ride leads to the spirit world in which a journeyer receives guidance. His physical path is illuminated by traversing the non-physical path of the rainbow serpent. This is considered to be a highly important initiation. Unlike many initiations which are designated by a tribal elder, this one is organized by the Great Spirit and the timing is divine. Lastly, there was one other possibility that I considered. I chose not to include it in some of my in-depth research because the location is outside of the search area, but there is a monument, a natural feature in Arizona called Rainbow Bridge, which was discovered by a relative of the Wetherills, and I'll include some pictures.